Over to you.
Thanks a lot. So what I'll try to do is basically focus on one, let's say, element of a digital transformation story, because there's many different technologies we could talk about. But I think I met Rafa and some of the other colleagues at the London Learning Technologies Conference, where I focused on extended realities, and actually presenting it as something new would be a bit strange, because I think this is an image of 10 years ago already. I think it was still under the presence of Secretary Ban Ki-moon that was launching. I don't know if some of you remember all these kind of 360-degree movies of, try to empathize with a refugee in a camp somewhere that they have been recording. And it was used mainly as a kind of, I would say, communication awareness raising tool. So the introduction of virtual reality or other related products is not a new thing. It's probably going on for the last 20, 30 years. Within the UN, you always see small pilots popping up. And this is also a little bit the interest of connecting with different other stories of the UN, like, well, when we do something and when it will respond to a business case, a problem or a challenge that we're solving, instead of going into eternal pilotitis, if I can call it that way, do some projects together where we can jointly scale up. And some of the stories that we're doing with the World Food Programme or with other agencies, I wanted to bring on the table today. And I would say also, see maybe if there's room, we are with 25, 30 people here, at least we have 5 devices, and join the experiment in one way. This was actually a picture taken, I don't think it was maybe right before the lockdown or during that kind of period. Yeah, and maybe also an interesting story of digital transformation, because usually in the different UN agencies, you would hop into the innovation hub or the whatever they are called. There are a lot of innovation labs these days, and then it would come from there. This transformation did not come from our shop. It was basically steered by Andreas, who's directing the entire training center. He was the first one of putting up, let's say, the immersive device and saying, okay, during lockdown, we don't want to be separated by screen. We want to at least have the feeling that we, are together in the same kind of room. And I think for about 6 months, he was running our management meetings through, let's say, immersive reality and Oculus devices. I already told him that was one big advantage. The meetings didn't take 2 hours, only 1 hour, because that's the maximum duration you can suffer in an immersive device. But also there, again, a kind of a situation. It's the introduction of a technology does much more than introducing a technology. I mean, it asks us the critical question, how long do meetings need to take before we come to conclusion? So if we can do it in 1 hour, why do we need 2 hours? So that's why I said digital transformation is much more about the cool wow effect that you have had with the Oculus. You should connect it with all the different dots out there. And that's a picture of already 2 or 3 years ago. There are 2 attitudes that maybe also might be extremely important for all technology. One of them is, I would say, the curiosity factor that is illustrated by Stephen Hawking here in saying that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, but that individual reflection, you should move it up at the organizational level. I mean, when lockdown happened, we could not say, hey, we're innovative, we have a learning management system. Everyone has it. Hey, we're innovative, we're doing Zoom and team calls. No, everybody has it. So the change was so rapid and fast that we said, let's also adapt really to that change, so that we are being confronted with Jack Welch. And when the rate of change outside an organization is greater than the rate of the change inside, the end is near. The end could have been possibly very near for a training center with us. If we would have sat there, locked down, we wait until this crisis is over. We didn't have that luxury, not only because of, let's say, the financial sustainability, because of the pressing issues that we had within our constituents. The same that you have, COVID was not an excuse to stop your operations because your challenges they went through. And therefore, we had to think sometimes out of the box. And that's basically the reason of, let's say, some of the stories that I wanted to share with you today. Always being sensitive, because when we introduce a new technology, happens a lot this. If we always do what we have always done, we will get what we've always got. If I look to the last introductions of new technologies, our first reaction is doing exactly the same as what we were doing before. If I look at how most of the Zoom and team meetings are conducted, it's basically the same of, someone broadcasting content through a digital channel right now. So are we doing the same, or do we want to do something completely different is also an important question that I would like to ask, and especially with immersive realities, because as I said, it's not new for those who remember Second Life 10 years ago. You know, that was the big innovation, creating 3D worlds out of it. It died almost 1 year after because people were realizing that Second Life was basically a simple copy of First Life. I mean, we were sitting in a room here. We would then sit in a kind of a virtual room and do exactly the same, listening to someone who's speaking up front. So there were a lot of people that said, no, get a First Life, Second Life, get it done, and, you know, get to the real business. What we are trying to show today is that getting back to First Life, it would be difficult because some of the stuff that we're doing in immersive reality is basically technically impossible in First Life, and really creates that added value that we are looking after. And of course, in the last thing is also connected with innovation. This was basically, I'm not going to let him talk right now, but this was when he introduced the innovation toolkit on it. And that also, you know, mainstreams the digital element across the entire portfolio. So it's much more than just this digital element. So in the unit that I'm leading, if you would look at the history of a brief history of learning tech, and I'm not going to talk about e-learning because I'm also quite familiar with your, let's say, learning management system that you have been popping up. You also have experimented, if I remember in the past, with gamification that is also integrated into your LMS. I'm going to focus also not on mobile and social because that's also a whole new domain, but really on immersive tech. I want to focus my presentation. But just to mention, there's a lot of different angles that we're not dealing in this presentation. And it would be also a problem if I talk about immersive learning. The domain is extremely big, you know, going from virtual reality to augmented reality to mixed reality. I could confuse you enormously, so I'm going to simplify it today and only focus on virtual reality. I'll make the three definitions to make it very clear. If we talk about augmented reality, what we would do is put a digital layer on top of the reality, but there's no interaction between both ends. If we speak about like mixed reality, there's a digital layer on top of the reality, and there's interaction between, let's say, the digital layer and the reality. And today, we're only going to speak about virtual reality, where you have a full, entitled, let's say, virtual environment. And specifically, if I look at the ILO, all these industrial settings, occupational safety and health, labor inspection, this is already around for the past 20, 30 years, also the whole industry. Where it becomes now interesting is that it goes beyond these classical boxes. If I would say that virtual reality is now used for soft skill training, for example, there's like all kinds of modules on inclusion, on conflict management. There's a whole portfolio opening up that people were not really aware of, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago, and might be interesting also to include in your learning portfolios. Not going to talk about the technology either, because that's the funny thing is the moment you bought it, it's already outdated. We brought some Oculus Quest 2 devices. I think it's already our third device after the ones that we have purchased, because that's also not the story that we want to tell. I mean, this is high-tech, what we usually do from high-tech to low-tech. You know, you have all kinds of devices. The technology that we conceive could go from very small scale community radio towards high immersive high tech. So for us, that's a second type of argument. It might become important when you want to use it. For example, we have been pouching almost 1,000 devices across the world in different operations, also in difficult locations with World Food Programme on their disaster response. I think we had to ship to Yemen, to just give you one example. It was easier to ship to Yemen than to Geneva. We were blocked at the border in Geneva because of the high amount of lithium in the kind of Yemen. It went very smoothly through diplomatic pouch. So you see all kinds of problems that appear, but it's part of, like, let's say the innovation journey that we're on. Exactly, also, we ask the same pedagogical questions as we would ask to any technology that we are dealing with. Yeah? There's a series that we have on skills-based training, specifically on, as I said, not only on firefighting or occupational safety and health, it's really going the whole range of, I would say, vocational training is really hard in it. Knowledge-based training, a little bit less, because we don't see, there's interesting as soon as we go back into three-dimensional elements, because it's very difficult to teach in 3 dimensions, or you need to really do it there. We would have a few assets there. And then the new one here on behavior altering, so like the soft skills and other kinds of elements, is extremely interesting field to apply immersive learning, because that's a new field that also is very difficult to do in face-to-face training. You can do it through role play to simulations, but the safe environment that you can create in an immersive reality is completely different than in real life. So what I wanted to do is basically go through some of these essential ingredients that you would need if you now think about your own training portfolio and say, what would it be if we would do something similar? What are all the different things that you need to take into account with? One of the first elements that we decided, this is not going to replace anything else. If you look at all the different technologies that we have introduced in the past 10 years, not at one stage there was somebody replacing something else. It was almost adding as part of our overall puzzle. So any curriculum, program, project that you will see will be a kind of an intelligent, smart mix between traditional e-learning, referring towards our learning management system, interactive, let's say, virtual classrooms, whatever technology you're using. If possible, if allowed, if essential travel allowed, also face-to-face, because still it has an important community building and networking aspect in it. And then on top of it, where possible, we do the immersive learning. It could be in smaller groups, the World Food Programme example, could be in very small groups, executive coaching we do now also with VR, team coaching also. So the applications are quite well. So that would be my first lesson. If you want to get acceptance in it, just don't say this is the end of face-to-face or this is the end of traditional self-guided e-learning. It's just, one of the few building blocks out there. I'm repeating this because we always put it into, there's a lot of reluctance and resistance when you introduce new technologies. The same with headsets. So focus on the mindsets. That would be my, let's say, element. And on the overall story, just see it as a part of, a few steps that you need to set. We looked at one model, which is called the, for some of you familiar, it's called the summer model. And we use it as a kind of a filter to see where are we going to use VR. And in a nutshell, the summer model says, look, if we only would use it as a kind of a substitution, okay, we cannot meet each other and we will see each other in a virtual classroom, then it's digitally enhanced, but it doesn't give you any added value. If I now see face-to-face or anything, it's exactly the same. What we try to do is basically move in towards, let's say, the transformation zone, so actually modify some stuff in the design of the room that gives us a completely new view on the learning itself. One example would be, we do strategic foresight labs in VR. At one point, you do exercises and you're asked, can you look at the entire new puzzle from a 360-degree point of perspective? In this face-to-face room, I cannot do that, or I have to stand on top of the room. There, basically, I can actually jump, look from a perspective where I see the entire ecosystem of all the deliverables that have been made. So I'm trying to augment or to modify something in the environment which was previously completely impossible. And sometimes I'm completely doing a redefinition of it, which is completely changing the mind game. We're working with an application which is called Body Swaps. That basically introduces us in conversations on particular challenges. So imagine you're talking, you're a counselor, there's a harassment case happens somewhere, and so you as a manager or as a direct responsible, you go into a conversation with the person out there. You're sitting in front of a kind of an artificially intelligent type of avatar that scaringly looks human, and you basically start to talk to him or to her. What is happening at one moment, everything is registered, and your reaction suddenly happens in a body swap. The perspective switches, and then you sit in the person of, let's say, the victim or the patient or whatever is the person, and you look at yourself, to your own behavior, what you were saying to that kind of person. So that's a kind of a perspective shift, which is technically impossible in a face-to-face setting, but for this, extremely relevant to do. I can do it as many times as I want, and that's where we're looking, where do we really get, let's say, the added value out of it? Where can we really ask, I would call it, new questions? Here is maybe one big question. Can we unlock human potential through lifelong experiential learning? That might be not really a triggering question, but let me ask you another question. For example, if you'd live in all skin colors, what would happen to your recruitment bias? So it's these type of questions that really shape a trigger, and there are actually interesting applications out there which you could use to address an issue. I'm doing a presentation right now. If I would have prepared it, I unfortunately didn't have the time, I would have used one of our VR applications, which is called Ovation. It's like if you had a standing ovation at the Royal Albert Hall, how confident would you feel for tomorrow's meeting? We have a kind of a public speaking app where you basically, with the glasses, you have an entire audience in front of you. It feels pretty realistic, but what the cool thing is about it generates data about actually how you speak. What is your body language? What are your words that you're always using? And extremely useful based upon data collected by a large number of really talented kind of speakers. So this would be me, myself, practicing somewhere in a room, public speaking. Doesn't work in face-to-face, but the immersive reality, I have data, I have feedback. I can do it as many times as I want, and maybe I will feel better the day that I stand in front of a real audience. So again, let's ask intelligent questions before we engage with the technology for the sake of the technology. And then we don't have to say, kids, go back to a first life. This was the parody that was basically designed after Second Life, that people were starting to have doubts about it. They put up this website, we finish Second Life, we get a first life, and do it a bit differently. I think these kind of parodies I haven't seen in the last, let's say, months about the new technological developments, because there's also a whole scientific backup of what they would call what are the learning affordances in 3D virtual learning environments. And I mean, not to go into detail out of it, but it's some of the aspects that really motivate learning, that really create that kind of immersive space that are not replicable in any other learning technology. Maybe a few concrete examples, because I mean, always when you talk about e-learning or technology-enhanced learning, you know these kind of arguments out there, but maybe if you illustrate them with concrete stories, it becomes more clear. Our first big project was with the World Food Programme. Their logistic cluster, probably also, I don't know if UNICEF is part of, this was an operation. You usually have a simulation training once a year, which happens in Germany or somewhere in Africa, where they go into a kind of a pre-disaster type of planning exercise out there. Very realistic, extremely expensive to organize because it involves helicopters and everything like that. And during lockdown, they said, we cannot do it anymore. It was extremely urgent because the amount of people that they need to onboard need that training. So we partnered up, recreated, I think, 4 or 5 humanitarian camps in there where they applied our hybrid learning model, and where, for example, the negotiation and, let's say, the coordination tasks that they do, they did it really in virtual reality. It was still combined with context setting through the platform. They had, let's say, their briefing meetings through Zoom meetings. They had a little bit of preparation briefs and also WhatsApp communication, but the real simulation where they were negotiating and where they really doing the whole plan and coordination happened fully in virtual reality. Then, if I would have to go back to the previous slide, what would have been? Well, it was a safe environment to basically to test it. They did it instead of 1 time a year, according to the budget, they could do it 5 times a year. And also it changed quite a lot, let's say, the entire setup that they have done with that training. That's just one example. Another example is, well, the high presence VR is the most high bandwidth communication ever device. It's memorable. We have been doing a few of these 3D learning labs in Torino during our innovation day, during actually 5 weeks ago in Durban with the big conference on the global elimination of child labor. And when we are looking at what people do remember, that kind of increased memory factor because of the experiences, often they refer to some of the experiences that we have had together. So you will be able to experience it after our presentation. We'll be quite curious towards your reaction. Learning by doing. As Andreas was mentioning, we have a lot of things, let's say, with occupational safety and health labor inspectors. These are a few programs that we have in Qatar and Sudan, where labor inspectors are basically going through really immersive environments where they identify occupational hazards and then report back towards the trainers on it. So it's a wide spectrum, but I want to say it's not only on the usual spectrum. When I was referring to, I think it's here, body swaps, that's also going from very highly technical stuff towards, let's say, soft skills training. I think there's one module that was also made on safeguarding that was done together with the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, which is maybe also relevant for your shop. So these are just a few, I would say, examples. What I think is also different is where there was a VR hype a few years ago. Now there's finally also empirical data that is basically making a comparative analysis. What is the difference between e-learning, immersive learning, and then face-to-face learning? These are a few studies. They're not academic studies. These are basically released by, I think it's PwC and Deloitte, but interesting to see on data sets what kind of conclusions that they are taking. Virtual reality is also not applicable on everything. It's also on a few segments that I have been explaining here. Before I go into the challenges, I'm going to quit for a moment because I would like to hear some feedback from your side. I mean, this is, let's say, the experience that we have gone through. We are beyond pilotitis. We are now scaling it up with all the scaling challenges that maybe we'll present later. It's not anymore from, let's say, the innovation lab. It's from people who have a real challenge. WFP cannot organize training, can do it now. Also, the scalability of our body swaps, we can pouch it in the entire world. So it really responds to a need that we have. It was not because everybody is doing VR, we have to do it as well. It was more the other way around. Let's see if that solves, let's say, a problem that we have. So I wanted to hear a few reactions from the group, or is it resonating? Or is it still something that is not connected with, let's say, your field of interventions? Anyone? It's hot in here. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the connectivity is an issue. I was, for example, surprised in some of the duty stations where you would think that's going to be a big issue because, you know, there won't be connectivity. But the creativity out there, for example, what connectivity you need for an Oculus device is the same connectivity as a Zoom call. So more or less we're on that kind of level. So when we had a few issues that was a rural type of duty station, when the connectivity issue raised, they immediately solved it by connecting it to their basically smartphone and putting it up. It also, we use these things maximum 1 hour in our thing. It's not that you're there 3 hours on your headset. It's 1 hour, so in terms of consumption of data, it's also feasible. So I don't think that would not be our main infrastructural challenge, although it's always the first one that comes up. Will the connectivity be okay? And they usually ask that to us when they're doing a Zoom call, and I said, like, well, you're doing a Zoom call, so anyway, that won't be an issue either. Huh?
It's not, the question of connectivity is not for this specific, we have that in general. But I was just curious, since this is a center, let's say, that looks at sustainability, I was curious how you...
Yeah. No, but these type of questions have, I think if what Andreas also presented has put digital inclusion more and more on top of the agenda, because we are fully aware when we present immersive tech that's immediately connected with not only the connectivity but also other questions that I could ask about it. For us, it's more where can we combine inclusion with innovation. In the past, when we talked about the learning management system, it was also what do you do and can people have connection offline? Our strategy was, of course, we need to also have an offline parallel, but at the same time, let's think a little bit beyond the classic parameters. You know, everybody has a mobile device which is not always depending on big data storage. So can we do interesting things through, you know, WhatsApp or other? Zimbabwe working with community radio, which does not ask bandwidth. We just have local podcast studios that are actually recorded, and we basically hand them over to the radio stations. So it's again more mindset type of elements than this kind of thing. Often we see that some of these arguments are used to show, okay, as an argument just to stop it, or to say, no, this is not going to work. We try to create a bit of space, taking into account that there are issues with connectivity, also other issues, but new opportunities might arise. One of the most surprising one was for me when in this whole lockdown where we are separated by screen, where people are completely zoomed to death, that for the first time when they had the immersive Oculus on it, I said, well, this is the first time that I'm in a meeting with somebody else, where I'm not just separated checking doing some emails and in the meantime listening to the conference as well. There I'm really in the room, I cannot escape. It's here, you can fall asleep, but I point you out. You know, like you're immersive in a kind of a space which you don't have with the multitasking nature and the boredom of the multiple meetings that we're daily in. So again, the question is, what can we do there and there? What makes it interesting? For me, is a much more interesting question than the practical question. We will fail once in a while. We just were in UNICEF. I had much more issues to put up my screen of my PowerPoint than to set up my immersive Oculus device. It's just the way that that's technology. Something will work and sometimes won't work. But as it will remain part of our life, as this device is now looking at something new, 10 years from now, this is going to be the new smartphone. So,
maybe if I can just add from a portfolio management point of view now, we are not arguing that all digital technologies are right for all people in all contexts. Often it's about that you differentiate your customer universe and then you have customized solutions for your respective needs. This is actually why we are in Budapest right now, because tomorrow we will have a one-day workshop to map out with our local office economic recovery strategies for the Ukraine, where digital technology is to be used in order to massively scale up outreach and also boost impact, knowing that you are looking at a country where the entire spectrum of this technology could be readily applied. So this is maybe also from a perspective of UNHCR, I would say, depending on the local context, you will have to find the right mix. But I would not necessarily argue that a certain piece of technology has to be fit for all purposes, all contexts, and all target groups, because then you will always end up on the smallest common denominator, and then you might miss out on these opportunities to leverage.
And here, just to give you an example, the fact that we started with the virtual reality type of thing gave, in terms of scaling, we scaled much more with augmented reality. We have big projects running in Bangladesh for the vocational training sector, where actually augmented reality, you don't need these devices, you don't need the high connectivity. The widespread of, let's say, cheap smartphones is already widely spread also with teachers in the vocational training center. For them, it was actually using their device or the big tablet that was part of the project to see, let's say, vocational motors, air conditioners that they usually had in two-dimensional handbooks before, but the technology was out there. Why don't we connect actually both? Because their handbooks and their manuals, they were outdated 10 years ago, by way of speaking. It would also be too expensive to go reproduce these old manuals for an entire country again. So one connects with the other, and maybe that's also, if you look back 10 years from now when we started, now there's a lot of things popping up, not because it's post-COVID time, because a lot of these different drivers are coming together. And we have, let's say, some support mechanism in-house as well, because if you roll out more than thousands of these Oculus devices, this is not the work of his department or of my department. There's a whole ecosystem around that basically needs to be supportive. How do you support it? How do you maintain it? How do you pouch it and everything? So, thank you. Okay, any other question? Yes?
Question is regarding modalities. You mentioned the logistic clusters training, and did that so you have maybe what I understood too, like you either bring people into one place and then they use the virtual reality for a few hours, debrief, and then work through the training, or you pouch these out so people don't have to come to one place. What has been your experience on what works best, or
the last one. Otherwise, if they can come, then we would prefer to be face-to-face, no? So there's no added value of the virtual reality. The virtual reality gives added value when we are remotely connected but don't have the feeling that we're in the same room. So that's what we do with this pouching. It's by accident that we are now in the same room with these devices, just for showcase purposes. But the remote thing is the added value, that you don't feel remote, that you feel in the same kind of room. In terms of your other question, yes, there's, as I said, it's also connected with some of the challenges, like how that pouch arrives somewhere in Yemen. There's the guy or the lady is opening it, and what happens then? Of course, we have instructions on how to install it. Usually there's a bit of IT support with it, but we have a whole support setup, not only in terms of technical things that need to happen. We also do a kind of an onboarding. These are 2 sessions of half an hour where we get with these people in small groups together, where they really explore the environment. Some groups are extremely fast. This morning we did it with UNICEF. It took 5 minutes. Some groups are a little bit slower and need, that half-hour induction of the experience towards it. So it's not just we start with it. We actually in our own campus we trained, I think, something like 15 ambassadors, we call them. These are people that are able to train other people. So we use them also now in the induction kind of experiences, both our support staff and professional staff, both across the entire, let's say, universe. So as I said, there are some issues there, so you need to look at it from a 360-degree perspective, not only technical support, training the trainers, the infrastructure, also there are different things to take into account with it. So maybe the other challenges that I wanted to mention is, okay, we're now capturing a lot of data through the different apps that we're using, Body Swaps, Arthur. We're looking for ways also how can we integrate that back into our learning management system so that everything is centralized and also feeds the reporting cycle that we have to do. So that's also work in process. And then also some of the initial issues that we had. The first Oculus that we bought, you couldn't get in without having access to Facebook within a UN environment. That was technically impossible. So we had to find ways to go beyond that. This is just one device. There are many other devices out there, but some of these things we had also in terms of security, in terms of privacy, in terms of all the usual, let's say, IT regulations that we need to respect. But in a nutshell, I would say these, let's say, were 3 or 4 challenges that we have. And of course, also, the return of investment, we can showcase it on a lot of things. What we still think is quite expensive is customized content creation. You don't have a movement within VR that you would say the whole open educational resources. Open source is just about to grow right now. You could go, if you don't have a license to any of the platforms, I recommend you to go to Mozilla Hub. It's an immersive environment, free access. You can experiment, but there's still limited amount of content that is out there that you can repurpose. So there we are looking strategically also. That's the reason why we partner up with World Food Programme, did it together, have now these things can be reused endlessly. And that would be a return of investment. If we have to reinvent it all the time, that would be a very costful operation on it. Any other question? Yes?
Yes, I have one on the soft skill part, because I'm part in the soft skill training, and this really grabbed my attention that with VR you could, let's say, improve soft skill, as I now understand what you were sharing with us. So one of the questions is, because with soft skills, I wouldn't say it's harder to measure the impact, but it's completely different to measure the impact. So would you say that with VR, you can better map the improvement of a certain stuff for a certain group? That's one question. And the other one is, what do you start then with the impact that you have? I mean, is it like a loop that you start a second training, or?
Yeah. Well, I think here different technologies are going to collide together, specific in the measurement of the impact of some of like soft skills, because if we would have now me as a judge, I'm coaching someone, I need to give feedback to someone. Also, there's a number of subjectivity in my own personal approach. And what I found interesting, and give you the example of the ovation, that's now not on soft skills, on public speaking, but you could make the same analogy with the other ones. The data that is inside Ovation is basically captured based upon best practices of 1,000 speakers that are considered to be, let's say, top-notch public speakers. So that's the data where you basically are benchmarked on. So basically the flow of my voice is not based upon a personal subjective opinion, but benchmarks you. Normally, the normal speaking speed would be like that. So it's really a bit more of an objective type of feedback that you get, but it all depends what crowdsourced data you have as a kind of a benchmark, you know. Maybe also within the data there can be some biases out there. But that's what I said, like the more data that will be feed in, the more elements that the more, let's say, interesting feedback you will have. And I've seen it also on the other ones on, let's say, the one I remember on conflict management, on how you react in a kind of a difficult situation. There's not answer A, B, C. It's not an exact science, but they ask you the right questions. You know, have you asked the question instead of, and this is the interesting part of, let's say, body swaps. It's almost a 30-minute kind of experience, but every reaction you do, they ask you a trigger question which helps you to reflect and move towards the next kind of thing. And you do it on your own. Would be extremely expensive. You have to hire 30 coaches to give personal guidance to some of these, let's say, people. So again, looking at that kind of element.
Because this is maybe also where, again, the bigger picture re-emerges here. It's not necessarily all linked to virtual reality. I mean, we would frame this in the context of digital transformation and digital learning and collaboration technology. And for soft skills, for instance, it depends on what you're looking for. There could be other ways of using digital learning and collaboration technology than virtual reality. For instance, if you want to shift perceptions of people, whether it's gender bias, whether it is perceptions towards inclusion, and you use communication and advocacy campaigns rather than virtual reality, there are ways, since these are often digitally enhanced campaigns, that you can use the data that you collect in order to build a result chain, or rather to prove your theory of a change rather along the result chain. I'll give you an example that you are tracking outreach. How many people have you reached? You're looking at engagement. What's the ratio of people that have responded? They pledge, they like, they share, they post. And what is the ratio of people that convert as a result of an engagement? That they change their behavior. They become, for instance, a change agent, for instance, or they join a campaign. So outreach, engagement, conversion can be one way of tracking enhanced capacity for the soft underbelly, for perceptions and value systems. When you look at conferences and events where many people say they have a role to play post-COVID-19 because there is nothing that beats the human-to-human interaction, people would immediately struggle to say, so what is that fuzzy thing, human-to-human? What is the quality here? And there are ways of doing it. Again, if you have hybrid events where you have face-to-face and digital meetings, you could look, for instance, at network density. You say, how many people did I know in this room before the event? How many people do I know after the event? With ACTA network mapping software, you can actually visualize this. You can visualize network density. Very cool. Again, you can get a little bit obsessed by this, by these applications, but they show you something about network performance. You can also look at trust. That's more difficult because that would be qualitative assessments, but you do these making sense applications where you are seeking testimonials of your participants and you build a narrative out of these testimonials to show that people trusted each other more after the event than before the event. Trust is probably the one thing that comes closest to this human-to-human thing that also our DG always talks about. He talks about the human-centered approach. But what is it? Probably trust. I trust the other person. So digital technology can help you to feed data into result chains that look at qualitative aspects of capacity that go beyond maybe knowledge transfer in a VR session.
Okay, maybe a few final slides that I wanted to share before we move into the experimentation zone. Usually, when you're confronted with a new technology, but the first time when we had the headsets, we were playing around with all the funny things. So that was the kind of roller coaster type of effect. But then to get it in a way, a little bit more in a structured thing, we were asking ourselves a whole set of, let's say, serious questions. The first one was already asked by Andreas. It needs to answer to a specific need or a challenge that you would like to do. Then we set up, of course, it's almost so it's like a kind of a project circle, but it's exactly the same we need to do when you want to start an immersive learning project, because otherwise it becomes playing around in pilotitis, or it doesn't really, address a specific need. So that would be my first big advice if you think about it, also here within UNHCR. One of the second issues also you all work with in your traditional e-learning, you have the instructional designers, you have then the technical people who also implement it. Here what I discovered that makers, so the VR technicians I would call them, they're not trainers. We usually partner up with these kind of VR startups, and the notion of not only pedagogical, instructional or design is something that you basically need to add someone on top of the team. So not only the subject matter expert that you have all over the place, also the learning designer, but you need someone who's also, is really experienced in user experience design in immersive learning. So it makes it a little bit more complex in terms of, setting up a good learning project. I try always to avoid abbreviations in my presentation, but maybe someone was asking, what's this UWAT saying? I'm a member of the AAAA, so this is the American Association Against the Abuse of Acronyms, but this one means user acceptance testing for those who were moving into it. What I like is that it's one of the first mediums, apart from the LMS and the other technologies that you use, that really combines visual and audio that you also see in other environments, but also with the kind of kinesthetic factor, the fact that we had our UNICEF colleagues screaming out loud when going on the stairs, because you have the feeling that you're going in the height, but you're not moving. So that kind of movement effect in there is something completely new to it. That's something that we discussed also this morning. Who of you had a Tamagotchi? Okay, at least 2 people. Always surprised that there are always some Tamagotchi users in the place. So were you sad when your Tamagotchi died? Okay, because that's an interesting question, because you could see, if you look at the Tamagotchi in terms of realistic user, it's basically the kind of digital pet that you had to, take care of, and then suddenly died, and everybody started to cry. But the Tamagotchi effect learned something important for technological design. It's not that was the most, balanced. This has not the specific type of Apple design type of quality, but it learns you one important lesson, that in technology-enhanced learning, that believability is much more important than realism in there. Who you see here, this is the first artificial intelligence human being, Sophia is called. She got citizenship somewhere in Saudi Arabia in 2016. But what you see in most of the virtual reality experience that we have gone through, if you're going to set up the glasses, you're going to say, wow, this is already quite advanced, but it's still not matching with reality, because reality, that's a different kind of step. And I think in the experiences that we are creating for World Food Programme, for me it was much more important to have a realistic scenario of how a disaster coordination meeting actually takes place, much more on how beautiful the helicopter or the plane or the people look. So this is something that I'm trying to still push to people. Believability in scenario, in storytelling is much more important than the quality of it. A new thing with a difficult word, ontological design. The space is the story. This is the first time that you also can take space into your instructional design. For example, we do now strategic foresight labs in virtual reality. For the first time, we are able to transform the methodology into the architecture. To make it an example, for those who know foresight, there's a technique which is called wind tunneling, where you basically go across all the different factors that you have studied in your project. What we did in virtual reality, we created an effective tunnel, where basically with the groups you walk in and you actually check out all the different things that you have done. So space is something extremely interesting in digital. If you go on a TED Talk, there is one person that asked himself, what if digital spaces would be physical? And he asked that kind of reflective question because he complains that our entire digital environment, specifically social media, do not have any architecture at all. It's basically chaos. And he said we need to become more digital urbanists and creating spaces that really make sense and that go beyond, let's say, the creation of a conference room. This is for us an important working point. And then the last one, that's it. I mean, if you would look at the most successful elements of learning, it always starts with the telling of some stories. But now the potential of telling stories in, let's say, virtual reality is much more, because you can integrate architectural elements, the space elements, you can integrate audio elements, you can integrate theater, role-playing, what World Food Programme was doing. They had actually actors doing some simulations out there. And then you have also all the elements of what the visual arts, games that are much more advanced than the virtual reality that we are doing here. And then, so it's basically becoming all these kinds of elements into the integration of VR, AR, and MR become really story scapers. And that's, according to me, the big potential of, let's say, the future of learning in these new immersive environments. Yeah. If I would ask Andreas, why did we start with virtual reality? Do they ask that sometimes to you? Like, what would be your answer on that one? Why did we start with it?
Because every morning we were waking up, and when we started digital transformation was clearly, when you look at the sustainability strategy or the balanced scorecard approach, always trying to see what can we do in order to reach more people, be more impactful, in a more cost-efficient way, and reducing risk of over-reliance on a single technology.
Yeah. And I would add also one thing, as I said, during COVID, when everybody was jumping on the digital train, some of them jumped a little bit too fast. That you almost had that kind of feeling, which I illustrated with this African story, that every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up, it knows it must run faster than the fastest lion or it will be killed. And then the story goes, it's from Thomas Friedman, in The World is Flat. Every morning also a lion wakes up and it knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle or it will starve to death. So the conclusion of this story is my answer to virtual reality. It doesn't matter whether you're a lion or a gazelle, when the sun comes up, you better start running. In a way to cope, because we are inundated by learning technology. It's not that I have a choice to say no or yes. What we do is let's assess it, let's try it, let's experiment with it, and coming in a stage where we really can scale it up. Because if we would not have done that, we would have gotten stuck really in, not only in lockdown, I think already way before, because lockdown and the COVID was just an accelerator, but it's that kind of mindset that not only took place there, it was already starting way before. I mean, you rewinded it with 10 years. I think it's a bit the agility also of the training center in general, which helps also to, move with these kind of things. So that's more or less the story. I think we have still 50 minutes to go into, let's say, some tryout, as we only have 5 devices with us, but also maybe some questions that you might have or something. Yes, Rafa.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just have one question, and it's about how do you think, for an organization or a group of people who is working in e-learning, what could be the first step that we need to start following in terms for us to understand where to start, how to bring all the ideas, and how to put, because we know that maybe the solution is not to replace the training, it's not to replace the program, it's how we can just mix this part of create new resources for the content that we need to develop in the future, or for some things that we already have. Taking in consideration that we have been working usually with e-learnings and blended learning, and this is something that is interesting for us. What would be your, what do you think is the best advice that you can provide for an organization who is trying to do this?
Yeah, just do it. I mean, in the sense of not into a kind of a Nike. What we often end up with, actually the first time we started was 2015, when I remember we organized a kind of a day where exactly here we had our colleagues sitting in the room. We didn't have the budget at that time to have these more, let's say, expensive Oculus Quest. At that time, 5 years ago, it would have been maybe $800. Now it's around $400. But we had plenty of these kind of carton things where you can then move in your smartphone and you have that kind of illusion. It doesn't work for a second, but at least it gives you the experience, and for it was triggering the curiosity. And until we found a first business type of issue, which at that time was we have the Maritime Convention of Labor Inspectors. They come to our campus basically to learn about labor inspection of ships, and then they do one trip to Genova. They go into a real ship. The problem is always a hassle to get there with 20 labor inspectors from all over the world. The ship needs to have clearance, so we said, why if we virtualize that ship, and that we do the virtual ship visits through a kind of a virtual experience. So that was actually our first project that had a need. We mobilized the resources. We started with it, and the project basically slowly died in a way that at that time the technology was not up to speed what we are having right now, but it was a kind of a first incentive, and then we jumped from one project to another project until then the Arthur came in and then something else came in. It's a very non-linear approach of, this is my log frame of my VR strategy. It didn't happen like that. It was more serendipity driven. It was also we now really need to plan it, otherwise we would go over, but connecting the right people, and not only the early adopters, because they will do that on itself. The maritime initiative was somebody who was completely technology phobic, by way of speaking, but it's different knots connecting with each other and then making sure that one or two projects basically lift off, and then you are gone, and have that kind of flexibility, not to be too obsessed by VR in itself. For us, the VR opened up also the door towards augmented reality. For us, it also opened up the door to, there was somebody asking on scale. We had a conference of 300 people. Well, it's technically impossible to send 300 headsets. We also discovered now a lot of VR providers that provide VR experiences on 2 dimensions. It's not the immersive experience, but it's actually interesting to, walk around in the computer in 3 dimensions as well. So it's more that kind of continuous curiosity, feeding it in with projects that are balanced, and then see where it basically ends up.
Quickly coming, you also see the difference between the chief learning innovation and the portfolio manager, because this is exactly what the chief learning innovation has to say. Do it. The director training would say, Raphael, be clear why you're doing it. Going back to the objectives, is there a technical case? Can you reach more people with the same amount of money? Can you do something better for these people? Or is it cheaper? Are you saving money somewhere along the way? Or are you able to generate more money in case you are looking to money? So it basically boils back to your competitiveness strategy, what your key performance indicators are, and whether you invest in digital learning technology application is basically going to be determined by one of these criteria. More, better, more cost effective, more revenue potential aligned with the governance criteria of your organization. So that would be number one. Number two is what we also said earlier, and here I totally agree with Tom, piloting. I would experiment. I would do a lot of small things rather than one big investment. And I would have basically a cost-benefit analysis that you let these experiments run for a while, but then you also have to ask yourself, do I just love this stuff and that's why we are doing it, or does it actually make a difference? And if not, kill it. And we keep on saying innovation, 2 out of 3 experiments statistically fail. I mean, we make most of them win, but it's because Tom is such a great guy. But usually 2 out of 3 experiments will fail, statistically speaking. So you have to have that stomach to also let something die that doesn't work, or just to replace it by something else. And that's maybe the last tip would also be look into areas where let's say the institutional resistance is not so strong, because you will see there are certain areas in your organization where there will be very limited appetite to try something new because there are vested interests, maybe also fear of change. And then there are some areas where people are willing to try it out. So I would sometimes also take the way of the lesser resistance by trying out areas, maybe greenfield, where people don't really have an idea what it is all about, therefore let you do it. You didn't mention the holographic projections, which we have done. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about it, because that's an area when 2 years ago, and I keep on repeating this joke, our Director General on 1st of April released his April Fool's joke on our internet, the ILO internet saying, or intranet rather, that he will appear in holographic projection soon. Ha ha ha, funny. And we were sitting in Turin and saying, like, you know what, that's a great idea. That's exactly what we're going to do. And 6 months later, we made him appear in a holographic projection, and it has become, well, first of all, nobody in the ILO had an idea what this is, so there was no resistance. And now it has become a product line for us, holographic projections. I leave this to you, Tom, because Tom was also instrumental in making it happen.
Yeah, because that resistance of the holographic joke, like when you look at now what is possible in terms of holographic things, you will probably see it with some pop stars or some very special occasions, but this technology is becoming extremely accessible as well. And because our Director General, the past 4 years, he basically lives on a plane traveling from one thing to all these short interventions, we said, come to Turin, but don't come. We stream him live into these kind of box. You see people taking pictures out of it because they had the feeling that our Director General was in that box. He was not. He was basically projected in it. And we said, well, that could be interesting if we partner up with other UN agencies. Imagine having a box in every big duty station. Could be one in Budapest, one in New York, one in thing. Because sometimes these very senior, high-level people need to travel for only an intervention of half a day. So what is the notion of essential travel then in here? So we started to test it. It was a little headache to get it done, but now it takes traction. 3 weeks ago, we were in Durban for the conference against the global elimination of child labor, and we asked it to the Undersecretary General Amina in New York. She could not come, and we said, like, what if we holographically teleport you to Durban? And funny enough, where all the other advisors said, no, they're never going to do that. So we just asked the question, and she said, yes, I want to do that. So I want to give you a little scoop on that one, because it was pretty funny to see, because when it was a very official conference with, let's say, more than 1,000 delegates. I think the videos should be somewhere here. And the Minister of Labor, he had like a speaking note, but he didn't know what was going to happen. And so he was basically talking about a hologram, and he was looking in the room, where is the hologram? Let me find it. It should be right here. That's, let me find it, so it should be under the postings. It's a simple box, but with kind of an interesting potential. So,
we welcome the representative of.
So that's where our Minister of Labor was extremely confused, because he was reading Amina Holobox and he didn't understand the thing.
Which is Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy General Secretary of the United Nations, Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group. I was told that we will be watching from a hologram. Are the technical people ready with that message?
So he was looking at the screen, but that was not the screen. So what you have is basically lighting goes out. There we have our holobox. He had a very small technical issue because it had to start immediately, which it didn't, of course. We just had to push it. Somebody came to the bottom and then moved their steps in. Amina is there. And so it gave like the impression that she was live at that conference for 1,000 people. And we thought, it's...
As a daughter of the African continent, it gives me...
I'm not going into speech right now, but we thought that was such a normal question to ask. There are 1,000 people from all over the world. They travel to Durban, and then they would see again a video recorded that they could see behind their computer. We said, no, it needs to be an experience where at least they have the feeling that she is in there. The fact that we use this kind of new technology in terms of reporting, it would be nice to look at the data, but we were told by our media people that her presentation was the ones that was featuring most in news articles and I think just because of the hologram, but her message on child labor also got the necessary visibility in there. It would be interesting to do with or without Holobox. If she would have just been projected on a video, that would not have been, newspaper headlines. And here again, it's the communication and advocacy type of element where it went by on. So again, this is exactly the same what happened with extended realities. We're doing some experiments. The box is soon going to disappear because the technology is evolving so fast that these won't be boxes anymore in the future, but just, let's say, transparent screens that you could put in a room which you don't see, but then you project when the lights are off, and then the person is there almost physically presented. And also the costs are going down on that one, because that was UNICEF was asking how much does that cost, and I said, yeah, if I would tell you the budget, you would say, that entire operation, just to give you an idea, has costed us around 40,000 euros to have the box, to have the kind of elements, but it's there. We can now use it for the coming 2 years, if I would calculate all the many air miles that would be reduced to thing, I would easily have a return on investment on this, plus also the visibility of your campus that we engage with, let's say, high-level technology, which is now being piloted in a lot of different elements. So yeah, thanks for calling up.
So how does that work? I mean, is she talking in New York and then
Yeah.
slides?
You can do both. So we basically sometimes do it live because then there's a live interaction with the audience. So she could speak directly with any question from the audience because she's seeing the audience out there. This particular one was recorded, but funny enough, we were asking to the people and they were thinking that it was live. Actually, it has the kind of live feeling to it. It's much more impressive that it's live. The one that we did with our own Director General, because when he comes to our Innovation Day, that is actually the moment that our staff has a direct touch with the Director General, and they could actually ask him direct questions on there. So, yeah. So we'll see if that will take up. But again, it's with any technology, and my prediction is in 2 years, the holographic thing won't exist anymore. As we see it right now, it will be already a much advanced version of it, which will be maybe just present in this room, we don't know. Depends on how accessible it will become. Any other questions? Yes?
I have a question. I've seen a concept it was a Snoop Dogg concept, I think, and there was a holographic projection of Tupac a couple of years ago. And is it like similar technology? Because it looked really high-end and it was quite fancy. And I don't know if you heard about it or seen it or...
Yeah, but a lot of, as I said, a lot of artists, the thing is they use all kinds of different things. The last one that I saw was that basically the artist was almost packed into a whole kind of thing and appeared in virtual reality in a big, let's say, concert that they were doing in what's the famous game called on gaming is the...
Metaverse also they were using.
Yeah, or Metaverse also in their publication. So you will see that a lot of technologies will collide together. The funny thing about this one, technically speaking, it's not a hologram, but it's actually an extreme advanced use of three-dimensional projection that give you the illusion that the person is out there. Because with a hologram, you would see it here in the room. This was like called up into a kind of a box. But this is a very small startup in the Netherlands that came up with the idea. When I met them for the first time, they were reacting on the joke of the fool's train. Said we can do that, and I asked them, "But how did you come up with that idea?" And it was a thesis of a young student that said, "I want to create something for people who basically, after that, like to have the kind of live memory of your, grandfather that you can reproject him into the kind of holobox and still have a kind of a contact with him." That idea, it was kind of amazing, but it completely failed. In terms of execution and thing, but it got a whole lot of other kind of ideas. So we got to connect it. We're now working together on a few projects. He's currently in touch with Madame Tussaud, all the wax statues. They said, no, we need to have these kind of boxes because then we have the real person also behind it. And that's the nice thing of a kind of an innovation story as well. They had a clear vision, but didn't know where they would end up. And the thing, pivoting, altering minimal viable product, doing it, I agree with the strategic vision, but as long as you don't do it, you will end up with, papers that, are classified or are adopted by the board, but you don't see it in reality. So this is also an important thing, the urge to do it. I must say it broke already many nerves into our organizational capacity because you always take a risk, we're shipping a holobox to Durban. There's a technical risk that it completely fails down, that we would have been a big issue.
Why don't you try from this issue with these LED walls? Because showing you also a bit how the real world and the virtual world come together. Because, and I keep on saying also, it's not an either or. It's not either VR or the real world. It's about basically merging these different realities along learning journeys. One thing that we did our innovation day last year and that we have invested in that we are having in use now is the LED wall that you can use as a trainer to interact with. So you have a piece of technology behind you that enhances your pitch as a physical trainer. Become an enter-trainer, if you want so. If you ask me, this is one way to go. It's definitely one way to go. Have a look at it.
No, it's actually, I remember the first time I was here at the Global Earth, I think 10 years ago, I I was fascinated by this large screen because it's nice, you know, we can project and that idea remained, but what you see now, the screens that are out there, they're amazing. This is like, you will see that we're using it now a lot for e-learning and for video production because the screen...
Can you make it big?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, seems to work.
So, no, it won't. But the feeling is like that, I'm pushing the screen, but I'm not pushing it. It's basically the screen becomes three-dimensional. And if I stand in front of the screen, and if I'm now broadcasting myself towards my online world all over UNHCR, people have the impression that I'm into a three-dimensional environment. And in that three-dimensional environment, we can project whatever we want. You will see in my speech here later, it suddenly transforms into...
Let's move towards another place.
So it moves into now a museum kind of thing, and actually I can continue to talk into it. So our future idea is this, okay, when we do something in Turin, it needs to be almost TED Talk type of features when we do it live, but also when we do it hybrid, we want that the viewer has something more than just, you know, an illicit green screen with, let's say, a static image on it. That it tells the kind of story. And this is audiovisual. This is not virtual reality. This is the future of how LED screens will basically evolve. Again, it comes, the screen is not doing anything. It's based our capacity to tell stories in line of the subject matter expertise that we are basically dealing with. And you need different profiles. It's not any more linear instructional design. You need combination with, I would say, design thinking would be very close to it, storytelling, communication, different elements that we're now trying to fuse into our learning innovation team.
If I may just have a chance to try the VR, and for this, for everything, I just want to say thank you, Tom and Andrew, for this presentation. We're going to share the questions for some of our colleagues that they are coming right now. Maybe after the demonstration, I can imagine that they're going to have more questions. So please, just give one. Thank you very much for the opportunity for us to have more technology.
Yeah, there's only one headset at each table, so somebody can try it out. There are also wipers that we finished that you can clean it to avoid COVID contamination.
So what we basically are doing, you have is actually one headset per table. We have already logged